So hello and welcome to the seventh meeting of the Freedom of Thought Research Network. As some of you may be aware from our emails, we are celebrating the 75th birthday of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Last month, we had Professor Ahmed Shahid join us, who was the former special rapporteur at the UN. And today we have two talks, one by Christoph Bublitz from the University of Hamburg, and second by Heping Dang from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, Shenzhen. So Christoph Bublitz needs no introduction. He's one of the co-conveners of this group, and he has been writing extensively on the right to freedom of thought in the last decade. He's going to take us through the history and key developments of the right to freedom of thought. So over to you, Christoph.
Yes, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me fine. So, yes, so let me share my screen. I share the screen. You do see my screen. Thank you. Yeah, so what I would like to do today is present some research. It's actually a little bit older research already, but it hasn't really been published yet. It will be published at least partially soon, but more about this in the end. So it's about the history of the right to freedom of thought in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And unlike the history of the freedoms of religion and conscience, the sister freedoms, if you will, the story hasn't really been told yet, although I think it is a little bit distinct, even though not as pronounced as the histories of these other freedoms. So in the next 20 minutes, I will give you like a rough overview and perhaps the gist of the genesis of the right in the Declaration with an eye towards the kind of questions that are relevant for today. Okay, to get us started, just to have everyone on the same page, this is Article 18 UDHR, and the first part reads, everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. So these are three different freedoms, as I will show in the following, and it's mostly accepted in scholarship. And even though they are 75 years old, at least with respect to freedom of thought, many things are not clear. The meaning is not really clear, the scope and its limit. And as a consequence, freedom of thought is a right without real practical application. One of the very few human rights, perhaps, I don't know, even know there's another one that does not really have any jurisprudence. There's only like a handful of cases, perhaps, in the world. And every time I give talks about this, I always invite readers, if you have cases where freedom of thought is a decisive legal criterion, please let me know. Okay, so often freedom of thought is taken to be synonymous with freedom of religion or conscience, and that is something I think the UDHR shows is not correct. I will come to this, but of course the general question is, what can we learn from the preparatory works for the interpretation of the right today? So let me start with an abstract observation. So freedom of thought is, of course, it's a grand idea. And it has been a grand idea for centuries before the Declaration. In Western thought, it can be traced in parts, at least in Western thoughts. And the idea comes up in the Western history of ideas here and there. So it's an old idea. But it was never really conceived as a right. So it was more like a large idea. And therefore, before the UDHR was adopted, freedom of thought was not mentioned in key historical rights documents. It was neither mentioned in the various drafts that governments and legal institutions and scholars prepared in advance of the Universal Declaration. And it was not included in a draft by John Humphrey, who was the secretary of the Division of Human Rights. And in preparation of the drafting, he compiled a list of the key constitutional and human rights. And he made a list of 48 articles, and freedom of thought was not among them. And lastly, perhaps worth mentioning is that there was the drafting going on in the Americas and they adopted the American Declaration of the Rights and Duties of Man, non-binding, and it even predated the Universal Declaration by a couple of months. And there as well, freedom of thought was not mentioned, unlike the freedoms of conscience and religion, which were basically enumerated in all of these documents. So this was the state before the UDHR, and after the UDHR, freedom of thought was adopted in virtually all subsequent documents, European Convention on Human Rights, and later than the American Convention as an example. So I think what we can say already, that's like the first diagnosis, that the UDHR transformed an abstract political grand idea into a human right. Okay, so how and why did this happen? So tasked with drafting the Universal Declaration was the Commission on Human Rights, which was, freshly set up, and they began the work on the document in January 1947. And at that stage, it was very unclear what this declaration was supposed to become. So what would be the nature of the document? What would be its scope? Is it binding, and is it enforceable, and how? So these were all very unclear fundamental questions. And likewise, many of the substantive questions were very unclear. And so it's not a surprise that already in the first meetings, the emerging geopolitical conflict between capitalism and socialism, East and West, however you want to say, came to the fore. And so discussions started to become a little bit ideological, and they soon turn on issues on the relation between the individual and the state, of course. So, and in these debates, in one of the first meetings of the Commission, there was a suggestion by a delegate from Yugoslavia, socialist country then, and he suggested something like to understand freedom as the harmony of the interest of the state and the individual. This led to a reply by Charles Malik, and I guess I should say some words about him. So he's definitely one of the interesting figures in this whole process. He originally came from Lebanon, but was a Christian, but he was also an existentialist who studied under Heidegger in Germany. Heidegger, of course, was, had some inclinations towards the Third Reich. And so he left Germany then, and then he became a professor of philosophy in Harvard. So he was kind of like an electric thinker, combining different schools of thought, so to speak. And historians describe him probably correctly as the towering intellectual of the drafting committee. So he replied to the socialist suggestion at the 14th meeting in February 1947. And what did he say? He said something like, the problem of the age was the struggle between the human person and her freedom on the one side, and the overwhelming powers of group, society, and state on the other. So, I should say these are direct quotes from the summary records, which are in indirect speech. So this is why this is an indirect speech. Okay, so, and he goes on, the state threatens to dictate what the person ought to think, what he ought to do, what he even ought to believe and hope for. The political state is becoming increasingly determinant of the very being of the person, and it does so by its laws, by psychological pressure, by economic pressure, by every possible means and propaganda and social pressure. Okay, so the picture he's painting here is quite clear. It's about the individual, who sees himself confronted by all these overwhelming powers of all these omnipowerful actors, the state, and perhaps not only the state, also society, and all these influences this has. And so the idea was to protect the person against all these influences, let's say. And he also was often saying things along these lines that when the committee now sets up a system of human rights, it will probably not fail to account for all the material needs of persons, food, shelter, social security, but it may oversee or threatens to oversee the immaterial, spiritual, and intellectual side. And so he suggested, and his antidote to the scenarios that he was just describing was to say, we have to place the person before the state, and somehow in a strong sense. And this corresponds to his philosophy, which is roughly described as personalism. That was a fashionable philosophical account at that time. I can't really get into this, but it shares the idea of some kind of a fundamental priority of the person before over the state and society. So a classic liberal idea. Now, and more concretely, he made some suggestions to the committee to say that if we protect human rights, let's think about what really needs to be included. And so he came up with 4 principles, and the second of them read like this. So the human person's most sacred and inviolable possession are his mind and his conscience, enabling him to perceive the truth, to choose freely, and to exist. So this, of course, led to a lot of controversy, especially with the Soviet Union, but also with others. But nonetheless, these remarks were echoed later when René Cassin, one of the other main figures of the drafting, was tasked with writing another draft of the declaration, which is reflective of the discussions that has been going on. And that draft took this idea of Malik up, and it read, individual freedom of thought to hold or change beliefs is an absolute and sacred right. So echoing these earlier remarks by Malik. Now, this is the first time freedom of thought as a phrase appears in the drafting documents. And this specific formulation that we are seeing here, that is Malik's formulation. But it is a little bit unclear historically whether it was Cassin or Malik who first came up with the phrase freedom of thought, because there is some differences between the French and the English records, and Cassin was writing in French, and so there it seems to be that he may have come up with this, and the English records are later. So this is kind of like an open question, I think, who came up with this specific framing. But I think we can say these two are the main figures driving this idea. Okay, so yeah, so perhaps I should say a little bit also about René Cassin. So he was a French professor of international law, and he went into exile during the Second World War, and he joined the de Gaulle movement in England. He had a Jewish background, and he did lose many family members in the Holocaust. So after that first draft by Cassin, and he was later awarded the Nobel Prize for his work on the Declaration. So he was also the president of the European Court of Human Rights later on. Okay, but not so much personal now. Let's go back to the thing. So after this first Cassin draft, where freedom of thought had its debut, the discussions were on many things. So freedom of thought was never really in the foreground of this. It was about all the war and peace and freedom of press, these big topics. So about for a year, we don't really find much discussion about freedom of thought in the records. But 1 year after, the discussion again turned to this article. And so we find a little bit of a discussion about the right there. And there, Cassin, this is now 1 year later, June 1948, he says something like this. According to the European conception, freedom of thought had a metaphysical significance. It was an unconditional right, which could not be subjected to any restrictions of a public nature. And he's also recorded saying, freedom of thought is the basis and origin of all other rights. Now, these are very strong words. This is quite extraordinary. So even among the human rights, this right has a special status. It might even be the origin or the foundation of all other rights. So these are very, very strong words. Now, what Cassin meant with the European conception does not transpire from the records, but supposedly what he's referring to is French Enlightenment, where freedom of thought was basically one of the main ideas. Okay, so in these meetings, there's another quote that I would like to read to you because I think it is relevant for today's interpretation. So Cassin was asking a little bit rhetorically, why should inner freedom of thought be protected at all? Well, he answered, that was because the opposite of inner freedom of thought was the outward obligation to profess a belief which was not held. Freedom of thought thus required to be formally protected in view of the fact that it was possible to attack it indirectly. So I think this remark is important because it shows us two things. So the question, how can freedom of thought be interfered with at all? It came up several times, earlier and also later in the drafting. And so some people or some delegates thought it hasn't really any practical value because thought is free for metaphysical reasons. We have already heard metaphysics earlier, or at least there's no really way to interfere with it, to violate it. So, and against these kind of observations, Cassin is arguing, well, but there are at least indirect ways. And the example he's giving here, so to profess a belief that people do not hold, that of course has traces in the history of ideas where, you know, people were made to profess certain religious beliefs and other beliefs that they did not have. So these are actions that are familiar from the history of freedom of religion and freedom of conscience. But of course, you can also expand this a little bit. So the interesting part is here, he says it can be interfered with indirectly, and that kind of settled this question. So it was never really returned to, at least from the records, in any more elaborate way. Okay. So we may now ask, we have seen why Cassin champions this and why Malik may have championed it. What about the Soviet Union? As I said earlier, they objected to this right in these very first debates. And I think there's an interesting turn. So their position changed over time. And here now in 1948, they are actually defenders of freedom of thought. And they defend it, for instance, in the name of science. So free science for them is an aspect of freedom of thought. And they also recall the persecution of free thinkers and dissidents in history. So they actually championed freedom of thought now and defended against suggestions to cut it. And even more, they proposed to place freedom of thought first in the article before religion and conscience. And as we've seen earlier, this is what happened, and this is why today Article 18 reads as it does, and it places freedom of thought first. So this might be a good moment to look a little bit more into the relation between freedom of thought and freedom of religion. So according to the construction of the travaux and of the declaration, freedom of thought is more general. It is the basic freedom from which freedoms of conscience and religion derive. We hear the word derive often in this context in the reports. So really, it really is the main, freedom of thought is the main and general idea, and the others are special cases. Now, this relationship between these freedoms is, I think, largely forgotten in today's scholarship, which, write not much about freedom of thought, rather treat it more as a peripheral issue, perhaps. And so what are the implications? Well, one implication is, of course, the legal rule of interpretation and or rather of application. So if you have more special rights covering certain areas, they take priority once an issue touches that area. So they are lex specialis, they are the special cases. But on the other hand, if we want to construct an interpretation of Article 18, you would have to start with a general case, and this would be freedom of thought, and explain what this means and the scope of this and the interferences with this, and move on from there to the special case. So I think this is how Article 18 scholarship should proceed, or at least the historical records suggest it be like this. Okay, so, and they're not synonymous. I think that's also something that follows from this. And I think it's even interesting to look a little bit closer, more into the history of ideas. So Article 18 protects freedom of thought and freedom of religion side by side. It's perhaps sister freedoms. Now, if you come from a historical perspective, that might sound strange and even be irritating. After all, free thinkers were persecuted and murdered in the name of religion for hundreds of years. So to say now we treat them, as equals or next to each other may sound a little bit strange. And I think, however, there's a twist here, and that twist might also not always have come through in legal scholarship. I think the twist is roughly like this. There is an old idea in Christianity that the inner side of the person is somehow inviolable. So, and this has been expressed in canon law, Catholic canon law, by the term forum internum, which has actually changed a little bit its meaning over the centuries. But it always was the idea that there's something inside of the person that is outside of the power of the worldly state. It could be in the power of the church, for instance, but there's something that governments cannot infringe with. And this is the forum internum. And now Protestantism somehow, reclaimed this sphere from the church and said, this is the inner side where God is in direct contact with the person, bypassing the church in a sense. And then, of course, the Enlightenment kind of like said, no, this is where reason and rationality are. But these are, very roughly sketch a trajectory in the Western history of ideas. And I think we see this in Article 18 reflected, even though we do not find specific references to this. But this is the trajectory of thinking that we all, and of the development that we also see in the evolution of Article 18 through the different drafts. So in the beginning, freedom of thought is very closely related to this religious freedom. It's, there was inviolable and sacred right. Even the reference was still religious. But then it gets more and more secularized and expanded. And so I think in this point, Article 18 is kind of like catching up with the Enlightenment tradition. And now, and the final twist is now, of course, following the Russian proposal to place thought first. Yeah, and I think this is the interesting development in the history of ideas. Okay, so after all, I think one can say that the human right to freedom of thought was a novel creation, and it emerged from a unique fusion of ideas, the French Enlightenment ideas, coupled, mixed with the Christian existentialism of Charles Malik, and then strengthened by the communist anti-religious sentiments. Okay, what, after all, can we learn for today's interpretation of the right? I think several points. So first, freedom of thought is intentionally framed and formulated in an abstract way, but it was understood broadly, so broad that religious and conscientious beliefs are basically subforms of it, and also, I should say, freedom of opinion, which is protected in Article 19. So this speaks in favor of a broad understanding, in contrast to the often rather narrow interpretations offered by some scholars today. The second point, I think, is largely undisputed. Freedom of thought is unconditional or absolute. And this, we've seen this in Cassin's remark, but many delegates repeated this. The third point I mentioned already, freedom of thought can be interfered with indirectly. And I think this implies that it can also be interfered with directly if this is empirically possible. And moreover, I think it's important to note with respect to Article 18, second paragraph 2 of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, it has a slightly different wording. And then we have in Article 18.2 the word coercion. So it prohibits coercion with freedom of belief. And now, on a superficial reading, one might think that, oh, therefore, coercion is the only means by which Article 18 can be interfered with. But this would be a misunderstanding. So Article 18 in the Universal Declaration was clearly something that you would not need coercion to interfere with, and Cassin's remarks make this clear, and others' remarks as well. And the same should be true for Article 18 of the ICCPR, because nobody really wanted to change the scope of the right. This was just a political and symbolic bargaining with respect to worries about proselytism. So this goes a little bit off now, but just to let you know, so coercion in Article 18.2 is not the only way to interfere with freedom of thought. What do we learn about the scope? Well, the scope does remain to some degree vague. So here are some descriptions that are sometimes used, perhaps not synonymously, but as part of freedom of thought. So we sometimes read about freedom of mind, freedom of choice, freedom to seek the truth, and so on. And so these are, of course, equally vague descriptions, but I think freedom of thought is seen as the most abstract concept that kind of like is able to comprise all of these concepts. So as a rough suggestion, I would think Article 18 now together, the trio freedom, conscience, and religion, comprises the intellectual, self-related, spiritual dimension of the person. And I think the history and the travaux do give us some leeway for a robust protection of significant aspects of the mind. Okay, last, I think I wanted to give a little bit of outlook. So where does the freedom of thought scholarship go? And so I think with respect to the historical research, there are some gaps, for instance, because verbatim records of some of the relevance debates are not retrievable. And I tried this with the UN libraries in Geneva and in New York. So perhaps they are somewhere in some private archives. So there's a little bit of gap, but I do not think that these records would reveal much that would really help us to get a much better understanding of how the right was understood during the drafting. And the main reason for this is that these debates, also in regard to other rights, just did not go down to the level of detail that would shed more light on these issues. Another avenue to do research would be to look about the philosophical foundations. They are indeed under-examined, but with the prospects, I'm not sure how good they are, because, again, also with respect to the other rights, these rights were not derived from first principles. There was not a shared philosophical view. On the contrary, it was often said that it's better to not argue about the philosophical foundations. Let us rather make compromises at a level of abstraction that we can all agree on. So because we will never agree on philosophical foundations. So I think this is an intellectually interesting pursuit, but I'm not sure it really gives us much for the current interpretation. So what I think is most relevant would be to apply the right to contemporary problems, but given its absolute nature, the scope must be narrow. So absolute rights by their nature must have a narrow scope. And this, I think, is the main impediment to its development. If this would have been a qualified right, I think we could have expect to see much more judgments, at least dealing with this aspect, and then perhaps saying, in the end, some other factor is more important and the right is outweighed by other rights. But because courts do not have this balancing element, I think they're very reluctant to invoke this right. So this is a situation, but I think also the trouble make it clear that this was not meant to be only a right in the books. This was meant to be a living right. And so I think perhaps the remark by Cassin that I mentioned of freedom of thought being the basis of all other rights gives us an indication here. I think perhaps it may motivate and perhaps partly justify constructions of further, let's say, context-specific, non-absolute variations of the right, if that is necessary, of course. Okay, so much from me. Thank you for my talk. If you're interested in the references and in more details, a chapter of mine is coming up in the Cambridge Handbook of Freedom of Thought, which is edited by Patrick O'Callaghan and Bethany Shiner, who I think are both on this call. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Christoph, for the excellent talk. And if anyone has questions, we have to hold our horses and move on to Hepping's talk, and then we'll get back to question and answer. Thank you.